Hemoglobin Glycation Index, HGI, or Hemoglobin A1c gap. Glucose flow versus accumulated glycation damage, paper number 1497, VPT Sharp 058, January 8, 2026, Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation. Category, Diabetes, Systems Medicine, Metabolic Physics. Preface: I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 36 years ago, in 1990. During the first 12 years after diagnosis, I relied primarily on medication, specifically metformin, and paid very little attention to lifestyle management, or to the detailed progression, patterns, and daily fluctuations of my glucose levels. During this period, my laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c values remained extremely high, ranging from 10% to 13%, indicating very poor diabetes control. In retrospect, metformin alone did not meaningfully improve my condition. After selling my high-tech company and leaving Silicon Valley in early 2002, from 2002 through 2017, a period of 16 years, the only practical method available to monitor my glucose levels was finger piercing. During that time, I measured my glucose 4 times each day, 1 fasting plasma glucose, FPG, measurement in the early morning, and 3 postprandial glucose, PPG, measurements, taken 2 hours after the first bite of each meal. This routine provided only limited snapshots of glucose behavior, and left large portions of my daily glucose profile unobserved. One unexpected side effect of this long-term finger piercing practice was that I was occasionally stopped at airport customs, because fingerprint scanners could not reliably read my fingerprints, likely due to repeated skin damage from years of glucose testing. Beginning in 2010, I started to formally self-study endocrinology, with particular attention to lifestyle factors such as diet, physical activity, stress, sleep, and daily routines. At the same time, I made a deliberate decision to stop taking all forms of medication, including metformin and vitamins. In other words, my body was no longer exposed to any chemical compounds. I relied instead on naturally grown foods and completely avoided processed foods. Following these changes, my laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c levels began to decline, steadily, falling from about 13% in 2010 to the 7.0% to 7.5% range. This improvement was achieved entirely through lifestyle management, without any medication intervention. After 2018, when the Libre Continuous Glucose Monitoring (CGM) system was approved by the FDA in the United States, I began measuring my glucose automatically every 15 minutes, generating up to 96 data points per day, because early CGM software did not integrate smoothly with my custom-developed medical AI software. I manually transferred the glucose data into my iPhone-based health monitoring software program. I did not reject this time-consuming process, because manual data transfer forced me to pay close attention to glucose details and trends, allowing me to observe patterns, trajectories, and subtle changes that would have been easy to overlook with fully automated tools. In my professional experience, automation can remove valuable opportunities for careful observation and pattern recognition, which are often the most important elements of scientific research. From 2018 through 2026, I collected nearly 300,000 individual glucose data points. In addition, since 1990, I have undergone laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c measurements, an average of 3 to 4 times per year, providing a long, consistent, and reliable biochemical reference record. More broadly, over the years I have collected more than 4 million data points, covering both biomarkers and lifestyle details, including original datasets and derived or extended datasets. For example, in the blood pressure domain, systolic blood pressure, SBP, diastolic blood pressure, DBP, and heart rate, HR, represent original measured datasets, while pulse pressure, PP, mean arterial pressure, MAP, and SBP spike amplitude are extended datasets derived through analytical processing. As part of my endocrinology self-study, I applied this accumulated knowledge to develop and evaluate publicly available conversion equations that relate glucose device measurements to hemoglobin A1c values. Through this long process of observation, calculation, and comparison, I repeatedly observed what is often referred to as the hemoglobin A1c gap phenomenon. Many clinicians insisted that laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c results were more accurate and treated them as the gold standard. I often asked myself that if this were truly the case, then why invest so much effort in developing and using CGM devices at all? Although I fully understood that finger piercing produces sparse data, only about 4 data points per day, compared with 96 data points per day from a CGM system, the prevailing clinical position remained that laboratory-tested values were the only trustworthy reference. Dense, time-resolved glucose data were repeatedly dismissed as lacking convincing power, without a clear, scientific explanation for why CGM results should not be trusted. Over the years, I raised this question repeatedly with medical professionals, including endocrinology professors and clinicians. Unfortunately, their responses relied largely on medical jargon rather than clear explanations, and none provided a simple or understandable answer to why high-resolution glucose data that clearly capture real physiological behavior should be considered inferior to sparse laboratory snapshots. This persistent absence of a scientific explanation eventually forced me to consider an alternative possibility, one related not to physiology or data quality, but to profit maximization, which lies outside the domain of science. Introduction. Most clinicians are trained to use hemoglobin A1c as a population-level risk biomarker, not as a mechanistic indicator of damage accumulation. In routine practice, hemoglobin A1c is treated as a single number, used to classify control as good or bad. The gap concept, defined as HGI or lab-tested hemoglobin A1c minus glucose-predicted hemoglobin A1c, mostly exists in research papers, and is rarely part of everyday clinical thinking. This study compares low-resolution, institutionally trusted solid-state markers, such as laboratory-measured hemoglobin A1c, with high resolution, but often dismissed fluid-state data, such as CGM-derived glucose metrics. This is not a diabetes paper, it is a systems science investigation grounded in math physics, using fluid dynamics, viscoplastic solid dynamics, and topology, to examine how glucose behavior is measured, interpreted, and misunderstood. From mid-2018 through 2025, over a 7.5-year period, my average glucose levels measured by CGM and finger-pierce tests consistently converted to an estimated hemoglobin A1c range between 5.4% and 8.5%. These values were based on a large dataset of nearly 300,000 data points. However, during the same period, my laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c values, based on only about 30 measurements, ranged from 5.8% to 7.4%. This formed a relatively narrow band, compared with the much wider variations seen in CGM-derived and finger-stick glucose-converted hemoglobin A1c values, ranged from 5.4% to 8.5%. In summary, lab hemoglobin A1c is 5.8% to 7.4%. CGM hemoglobin A1c is 5.4% to 8.5%. This persistent hemoglobin A1c gap troubled me for more than a decade. I raised this question not as a casual observer, but as a long-term type 2 diabetes patient who had worked relentlessly to regain control. In 2009, my laboratory hemoglobin A1c was close to 13%. By 2025, through sustained lifestyle management, I reduced it to about 6.8%. This modest but meaningful improvement, achieved without any medication, required years of lifestyle discipline, especially sustained changes in daily diet and exercise behavior, combined with relentless self-monitoring. Yet despite this progress, I was repeatedly criticized by clinicians for poor glucose control, based mainly on laboratory hemoglobin A1c values. Each time I asked why my daily glucose measurements showed good control, while my laboratory hemoglobin A1c remained about 0.5% to 1.0% higher than glucose-based hemoglobin A1c estimates, I received explanations filled with medical jargon and biochemical terminology that never addressed my real question. Over many years, I discussed this issue with hundreds of medical professionals around the world. Not a single one provided a clear, simple, or comprehensible explanation. This was deeply frustrating. I was not asking how to lower a number. I was asking a basic system question. Why does controlling glucose day by day slow damage, but not erase damage already recorded by hemoglobin A1c? I wrote this paper to answer my own question as clearly as possible, using plain language and physical system-based thinking instead of medical jargon. Two different things are being measured. The key to resolving this puzzle is understanding that CGM-based glucose and laboratory hemoglobin A1c measure two fundamentally different things. Laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c and CGM, glucose-converted hemoglobin A1c, are not supposed to match. CGM and finger-pierced glucose measurements show how much glucose is flowing through the blood at each moment. When averaged, they describe the current metabolic load placed on the body. In simple terms, glucose-derived hemoglobin A1c values represent glucose flow. A laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c number does not show how glucose moves day to day. It shows only the long-term result. It is like a year-end balance sheet rather than a daily price chart. Lab-tested hemoglobin A1c reflects how much sugar has slowly attached to hemoglobin, the protein inside red blood cells that carries oxygen throughout the body. This number hints at cumulative wear and tear, but strictly speaking, lab-tested hemoglobin A1c measures only glycation damage to hemoglobin, not real-time glucose behavior. Once recorded, this damage does not disappear quickly, even when glucose levels improve. Put simply, CGM shows what is happening now. while laboratory hemoglobin A1c shows what has already happened. A simple physical analogy: imagine pressing your thumb into a piece of soft clay. If you press hard for many years, the clay becomes deeply deformed. If you later press more gently, the deformation slows. But the old dent does not disappear. Lighter pressure reduces further damage, but it cannot undo what has already occurred. In engineering terms, this is viscoplastic deformation. This is exactly how long-term diabetes damage behaves. High glucose over many years causes structural injury to human organs, tissues, and even cells. Lower glucose later slows new damage, but it cannot fully erase past damage. This is not chemistry. This is basic mechanics. Why these two numbers do not match. Expecting CGM-based hemoglobin A1c and laboratory-tested hemoglobin A1c to match exactly assumes the body behaves like a rubber band that snaps back once stress is reduced. The human body does not behave this way. It is not fully elastic. It behaves more like clay, in a viscoplastic, time-dependent manner, with damage that is partly reversible and partly irreversible. CGM glucose data converted hemoglobin A1c values show that I have reduced my ongoing stress. My laboratory hemoglobin A1c values show that my accumulated damage still exists. Both statements are true at the same time. There is no contradiction. What my long-term data shows: over more than 15 years, my glucose flow improved and stabilized at a safer level. My laboratory hemoglobin A1c dropped steadily from about 13% to about 7%. The speed of damage accumulation clearly slowed. Damage was not erased, but progression was reduced. This is exactly what should happen in a biomedical system that remembers its past. Lower stress does not reverse history, but it changes the future. Seen from this perspective, a laboratory hemoglobin A1c of about 7% in someone who once lived at 13% is not a failure. It is a major success in systemic stabilization. Even if a clinical chart labels it as only barely acceptable or suboptimal. I have been criticized many times by clinicians, but I must acknowledge that I achieved significant improvements without medication. Dr. C snapshots. I see the full movie of my 36-year struggle. Why this was so hard to explain clinically. Most clinicians are trained to focus on target numbers, averages, and treatment thresholds. They are not trained to distinguish between fluid flow variables and accumulated solid-state variables, or between reversible systems and partially irreversible ones. As a result, biomarkers are often discussed without a clear understanding of their physical meaning or the ability to explain that meaning. This is not because clinicians lack intelligence or care. It is because medical training emphasizes biology and chemistry, while largely avoiding mathematics and physics. Over time, this training discourages direct confrontation with physical realities that do not fit standard models. I see medicine as a high-rise building. A truly strong and stable structure requires at least 4 vertical columns: mathematics, physics, biology, and chemistry. Modern medical training stands mainly on 2 columns: biology and chemistry. It may appear solid under calm conditions, but under strong stress, its weaknesses become visible. When patients ask system-level questions, but receive jargon-filled answers, frustration is inevitable. What this means for patients: I am not failing glucose control because my laboratory hemoglobin A1c did not reach 6%. I am succeeding at slowing damage, which is the only realistic goal once long-term injury exists. CGM measurements matter because they reveal whether daily glucose stress is being controlled. Laboratory hemoglobin A1c matters because it represents accumulated glycation damage from the past. No clinician has ever explained this distinction to me. Instead, they focus on whether hemoglobin A1c crosses an arbitrary threshold and assign blame, without explaining what part of the damage is reversible, and what part is already done and irreversible. These two measurements serve different purposes. Comparing them directly without understanding their difference leads to confusion, misplaced blame, and loss of patient dignity. Comments on writing style and accessibility. This paper deliberately avoids heavy medical language, or engineering terminologies. Terms such as glucose flow and accumulated damage are used not to oversimplify, but to clarify meaning. More than 500 million people worldwide live with diabetes, representing about 6.2% of the global population. In plain terms, roughly 1 out of every 16 people is affected. Diabetes is one of the most direct and influential drivers behind more than half of major mortality diseases, including heart attacks, kidney failure, limb amputation, stroke, and even cancer. Most people living with diabetes do not think in equations, theories, biological pathways, or chemical reactions. They think in effort, discipline, daily decisions, and lived experience. If the goal is to benefit patients directly, then using clear and accessible language is not a weakness. It is a strength and a responsibility. Conclusive reflection. This puzzle of the hemoglobin A1c gap remained unresolved for more than a decade until I explained it, using math, physical concepts, and engineering systemic thinking, together with the VPT, Viscoplastopology, framework. rather than relying on traditional medical labels. Laboratory hemoglobin A1c represents accumulated damage. From a VPT, Viscoplastopology, perspective, it belongs to both fluid VMT and solid VMT, where history matters and deformation is partially irreversible. CGM and finger-pierced glucose measurements represent ongoing glucose movement, like river flow. From a VPT, Viscoplastopology, perspective, this is fluid VMT. It reflects current stress applied to the system, not damage already stored. Once this distinction is made, the hemoglobin A1c gap is no longer confusing. The two measurements are not supposed to match. One describes present flow, the other records past accumulated damage. Lowering glucose flow slows future damage, but it cannot erase damage that is already accumulated. Reduced daily glucose changes the future slope of diabetes damage, not the past history. This explanation required no reliance on chemistry, pharmacology, statistics, or medical authority. It required only physical understanding and internal consistency. That is why this perspective allows earlier risk recognition and deeper understanding than traditional medical explanations. At least for me, this closes the puzzle. Epilogue: my body is my own medical laboratory. Nearly 90% of my published medical research is based on my own health data. When I see data, curves, charts, and graphs, or when I read my own papers, I do not see abstract information. I feel them more deeply than most diabetes. Doctors can feel for their patients, unless they themselves live with diabetes and its multiple consequences. Those numbers and shapes carry my suffering, the worry of my loved ones, my internal fear, and countless moments when I did not know whether I would survive. They also carry years of solitary medical study, conducted without guidance, mentorship, reassurance, or even moral support, when I had no choice but to rely entirely on my purpose, reasoning, discipline, persistence, and even physical strength. This path was not chosen out of ambition, fame, money, or curiosity. It was forced on me by necessity. If my life had not been at risk, I would never have walked on this lonely and difficult route. I did this to save myself first, and only later realized that what I learned could also benefit others. Every curve represents lived time. Every data point marks a decision, a mistake, a correction, or a moment of clarity earned under pressure. This work is not research observed from a distance. It is life recorded, analyzed, and understood from the inside. Disclaimer: I write this paper not for fame, but to share what I have learned so others can understand their health, prevent disease, and live longer, healthier lives. This content is provided for educational reference only, and does not constitute medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is created. You may share this summary freely, but it must not be altered, edited, or republished as your own. All intellectual property rights and copyrights for this article, and its related materials belong to the author, Gerald C.